and welcome to our next session, which will be led by Amy Zegart and is entitled From the Boardroom to the Sit Room, a discussion of technology, economics, and governance challenges. Following this session, we will hear from Director Rice for concluding remarks to our outstanding retreat. So thank you for being here. Amy Zegart is a Morris, Arnold, and Nona Jean Cox Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, is a professor of political science by courtesy at Stanford, and also a Senior Fellow at Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. She's also chair of Stanford's Artificial Intelligence and International Security Steering Committee and a contributing writer at The Atlantic. Amy specializes in U.S. intelligence, emerging technologies, and national security, grand strategy, and global risk management. She's the author of 5 books, and her research includes the leading academic study of intelligence failures before 9/11, published as Spying Blind, the CIA, the FBI, and the Origins of 9/11. Amy has edited with Herb Lynn, Bytes, Bombs, and Spies, the Strategic Dimensions of Offensive Cyber Operations. And Amy and Dr. Rice also co-authored Political Risk, How Businesses and Organizations Can Anticipate Global Insecurity, which is based on their popular Stanford MBA course. Amy's forthcoming book is entitled Spies, Lies, and Algorithms, The History and Future of American Intelligence. Please welcome Amy Zegart. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Eric. It's great to be with all of you. I know we're talking during the lunch hour, so I hope we're going to set the table with some food for thought for everybody. I want to give a little bit of background before we jump in. John Taylor and I are co-chairing a new Hoover working group that is examining key issues in technology, economics, and governance. And these issues include the role of the private sector in national security and the role of government in fostering technological innovation. As you can imagine, it's a very broad set of issues that are designed to cut across traditional boundaries. These boundaries include between economics and national security policy, between domestic policy and foreign policy, between levels of government, so local, state, and federal, and between sectors, between the public sector, the private sector, and of course the academic sector and what we do here at the Hoover Institution. I want to start by thanking our director, Condi Rice, who really came up with this idea and has been driving us forward over the past several weeks. John Taylor, Condi, and I have been in listening and learning mode. We've been having discussions with private sector leaders like the incomparable John Chambers, who's joined with us here today. And we've started working with a broader set of Hoover colleagues on some initial research projects as inputs to the broader effort that we're going to be launching this summer. Just to give you some idea of what we've been doing, we have a white paper that Condi, John, and I have been developing that will be posted shortly to the Hoover Institution website. And we have 6 streams of initial research with our terrific colleagues across disciplinary lines, led by Neil Ferguson, Leo Hanian, Caroline Hawksby, Herb Lynn, Jackie Schneider, Dave Brady, and Doug Rivers. So if you know these folks at the Hoover Institution, you know they cover a wide array of different areas of expertise, and we're really excited to be moving forward. Now, often Hoover panels, especially at retreats like this, showcased finished research. But this session, we're going to do something a little different. The aim here isn't to give answers, it's to sharpen our questions, to explore and learn together, to better understand what's new, what the challenges are in this broad set of issues, and what the solution set could be at the beginning phase of this working group. Now, each of our terrific panelists is going to share perspectives and thoughts and some initial remarks. Then we'll have a conversation among each other, and then we'll open it up for your questions and your perspectives. With me today are 3 leaders from different fields, and it's always a pleasure to be with people who need no introduction, but I'll give them one anyway. And they represent economics, entrepreneurship, and of course, the military. First, my partner in crime in this endeavor, John Taylor. You all know John Taylor well as the George P. Shultz Senior Fellow in Economics here at Hoover and the Mary and Robert Raymond Professor of Economics at Stanford. John's areas of expertise run widely and include monetary policy, fiscal policy, and international economics. His research includes, of course, what has been known widely as the Taylor Rule, not named by him, but you know you're an influential academic when there's a rule named after you. He served in government in several capacities, including as a senior economist on the Council of Economic Advisors, for Presidents Ford and Carter, as a CEA member under President George H.W. Bush, and as Undersecretary of Treasury for International Affairs from 2001 to 2005, where he was responsible for currency markets, international development, oversight of the IMF and World Bank, and coordinating policy with the G7 and G20. With us today also is John Chambers, the founder and CEO of JC2 Ventures, which helps early stage disruptive startups around the world grow and scale. Before that, he was CEO, chairman, and executive chairman at Cisco Systems. During his 25 plus years at Cisco, John Chambers helped grow the company from $70 million to $47 billion. Talk about a metric of success. He's worked closely with leaders worldwide. I counted 9 secretaries of state, 2 US presidents, and he's worked closely with the governments of France and India to transform economic opportunities, lead in corporate social responsibility, and global development. And he's putting us all to shame because he's also an author of a book called Connecting the Dots, Lessons for Leadership in a Startup World. And his awards include being named one of Business Week's top 25 executives worldwide and Time Magazine's 100 most influential people. Finally, on our panel, we have General David Goldfein, who served as the 21st Chief of Staff of the US Air Force. In that role, he served as the Senior Uniformed Air Force officer responsible for organizing, training, and equipping nearly 700,000 Air Force personnel, as well as serving as a member on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which, as you know, provides military advice to the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Council, and the President of the United States. Before that position, General Goldfein served as the Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and he has flown more than 4,200 hours as a command pilot, including combat missions and operations Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Allied Force, and Enduring Freedom. I want to welcome all of my fellow panelists here today, and kicking us off with initial remarks, I'll turn to John Taylor.
Thank you so much, Amy, and it's great to be on with 2 distinguished colleagues to talk about this important subject. I thought I'd begin with a subject that's kind of near and dear to many of us. That's firms leaving this state of California. It raises a lot of issues that we're going to be asking. Hewlett-Packard Enterprise is moving to Houston. Oracle is located in Austin. Elon Musk said he is moving personally to Texas. Joe Lonsdale, who has been involved with us, is moving his venture firm to Texas. And he just did a Wall Street Journal op-ed called California, Love It and Leave It. Mary Meeker has been writing quite actively on this subject and has spoken about it many times. What are the reasons? Well, I think economics has a lot to do with it. High taxes, 13.3% personal rate in California, nothing in Texas. Corporate tax rate, 8.84 in California, nothing in Texas. Regulatory differences. California has the second, if not the highest regulatory burden on employment in the whole 50 states. Land use regulations, our colleague Leo Hanian, who Amy just mentioned, is showing that California is one of the most restrictive states in terms of land use. I think COVID-19 has magnified the issue because in many respects, people do not need to live near the place they work. They can work anywhere. Facebook said that about half of its employees will be telecommuting in the future. Now, to be sure, there's some hopeful signs on the way. I like to look for some hope. Californians approved Prop 22, which classified drivers as and platforms, independent contractors, and nullified AB 5, Assembly Bill 5. And that's a good sign. The Californians also rejected Prop 15, which should have raised taxes on commercial and industrial real estate. Also, let's not forget, there's still an important underlying dynamism. The medium Zoom is started by Eric Yuan, who's just a few miles from where we stand right now, and is fueling the growth of much telecommuting. And as I say, one business leader who has departed said, "I still love California." I hope to help fix it. But the truth is, it's time to get to work. Now, this segues into what I think is kind of a national problem. A couple weeks ago, the House had a hearing. It was called The Disinformation Nation: Social Media's Role in Promoting Extremism and Misinformation. There were tough questions. The three witnesses were Mark Zuckerberg, Sundar Pichai, and Jack Dorsey. The members wanted yes or no answers. It were hard to answer yes or no. They kept trying to get, well, I can't answer yes or no, sir, et cetera. Just yesterday, there was a hearing in the House Judiciary Committee on Antitrust, Competition, and Consumer Rights. It was chaired by Senator Klobuchar and Ranking Member Mike Lee. It was all on apps. There were compliance officers from Google and Apple in the hearing. There were many complaints and a few discussion of benefits. One of the interesting things for our panel is Senator Lee was widely quoted as saying, those woke barons in Silicon Valley, they're causing the problems, the woke barons. He actually delved into the Parler issue quite a bit. He blasted Apple, Amazon, and Google. He said he's effectively worked with Apple. Apple is going to change and give more of a platform for Parler, and he's waiting for Google and Amazon. But it just indicates this is an issue which is really not partisan. There's different aspects that people are coming out of it. I like to think that these firms, the very subject of our panel, provide benefits. And that's what I see. I just was in North Africa and I saw how the whole continent was benefiting by better information. And I think that can spread. It can be much more helpful if we have the right attitude. Amy asked a little bit about what to do, and that's really the question for the future. But first of all, I would say, let's worry about a broadband for all, because a lot are missing out on this, and broadband for all is one way that we can do that. I also think that the United States has focused on competition and free markets, and that's where a lot of the ideas are coming from, and they're continuing to come. So let's not forget that. And the third thing I mentioned, this has to do with a lot of my experience in the sit room, and went to hundreds of meetings. And what I think is important for us is to stress the economic aspects of our foreign policy. It goes very much with the diplomacy. It goes very much with the defense and security, but it's frequently forgotten. I can remember many times raising an economic issue in the sit room, and they'd say, oh, there goes Taylor again, saying something on the economics. But the truth is we need to keep emphasizing it. And sometimes it's hard, but I think more and more it's going to be important, whether we're considering our adversaries or our friends, to focus on the economic side of this. So I'll leave it at that, Amy. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, John, for giving us a lot to think about. Let's turn next to John. It's the John Show. We're going to turn to John Chambers next.
Amy, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. The exciting thing is I've seen almost every movie we're talking about. I've been in the industry for 40 years. I've worked very close with government leaders around the world, both defense and civilian government leadership. And I had the unique opportunity to experience this multiple times in my life, what we're talking about today. I grew up in West Virginia when West Virginia was one of the top economic centers of the world. 6,000 top chemical engineers, 125,000 top miners, well paid, and we had more millionaires in West Virginia than they had in all the UK. But because we kept doing the right thing too long, because we let others disrupt us, we lost the industries and the leadership. And you can say what's relevant to that today. That's exactly what I saw in Boston 128 when I was with Wang Laboratories and before that IBM. Boston was the Silicon Valley of the world. We looked at California, some very unique people out in California that we didn't really understand. And in a period of a decade, you saw companies you don't even remember, a Digital Equipment, a Data General, a Wang lose literally millions of jobs because they failed to change. And we took it for granted that government and business and the universities and the VCs did not need to work together. I came out to Silicon Valley, had the honor of leading Cisco and was in the right spot at the right time, made lots of mistakes, but also a number of successes. And the lessons learned is that you must realize we've moved into a period of speed of innovation enabled by technology that's going to allow disruption, either for you to disrupt or be disrupted at 3 to 5x what you saw before. And if you've watched that go from IBM and mainframes, which by the way, they didn't make the transition to mini computers. Dec and Wang and mini computers did not make the transitions to PC client servers. PC client servers did not make the transition to the internet, Cisco. Cisco did not make the transition to the cloud. Cloud is now moving to AI into the edge. And each of those segments, without exception, the leader in the first one never was the leader in the second one. That is the most likely scenario. So part of the challenge is that it appears so obvious to everyone. What do you deal with the giants today? And their economic power is tremendously strong. But historically, the market, the large giants don't reinvent themselves. And it's the new innovative companies that provide both the jobs and the creativity of the nation. We used to talk about every country, every company becoming a technology or digital company. It was an idea or concept. To many people on the broadcast, technology is almost separate from operations of a company. No longer. Every company and every country in the world become digital. You speak about countries, Prime Minister Modi in India, who I think is doing one of the best jobs in the world on many, many challenges. He will have his economy in the top 2 economies growth-wise for the next decade. But he organized it around a digital country. Digital manufacturing, digital startups, digital smart cities, how it's going to address the environment with an architecture that played them together. A France in Europe that was the worst place in Europe to do business, to do a startup. Great place to visit, but it's not where I would put my employees. And the last place I would do a startup. However, when you saw a leadership change 5 years ago, Macron was, in my opinion, the key driver behind that, although Hollande played a role in setting it up. They went from startups, venture capital back of about 100 to 140 a year for a decade to 500 in just 5 years. It is now the best place to do a startup and the best place to invest your money as a venture capitalist in Europe. The point that I'm making, we think of Silicon Valley out here on the West Coast as entitled. We are not. We are in deep trouble per John's earlier comments. More businesses are leaving California than coming this way. Every startup used to think wherever they were in the world, I want to come to Silicon Valley. Now you've got the reverse. Not only are our startups leaving and key VC players leaving, you're seeing almost no one want to come to this environment because of regulatory issues, tax issues, almost a not welcome type of sign. And while Texas and many other parts of the country are starting to gain momentum, we have moved from the leader in innovation to countries like China moving perhaps 2 to 3 times faster than we are. And so we need to think about this as a true national priority, a digital country with startups being where the jobs will be created. The large companies in total will not add any headcount over this next decade because of artificial intelligence and because of the productivity is going to occur. So if we do not reinvent ourselves as a startup nation that is inclusive across 50 states and that is inclusive regardless of gender, color of our skin, background, or religion, we're going to have a country that is not the economic powerhouse we are today, and definitely not where we were 10 years ago. It's very manageable, but it's going to require government and business and citizens working in a very unique way. It's why I think that topic today, Amy, is so important for all of us to be dealing with. And last comment, just to kind of put in perspective my comments on China. The US used to lead in the top 20 technologies. John Hennessy, the president of Stanford, would say the leadership, not only in the US, but within 25 miles of Stanford, was where 80 to 90% of the leadership of the world is. Today, there have been a number of reports, and David, you're probably very familiar with them, and John, that when our US Defense Organization began to look at technology leadership, US versus China, especially as it relates to defense, out of the top 20, China led in 15, The US only let in 5. They have a national policy to go after this. We do not have a national policy. So I think we've got to rethink what we need to do, rethink about the role the government and business can do together. But every company and every strategy has to be founded on digitization and technology.
Thanks, John. This is teed it up beautifully for David Goldfein to talk about the national security side of things. Over to you.
Thanks, Amy. And my new call sign is Dave, and I'm enjoying it. They're in chapter 2. Let me offer you a thesis statement up front, and then a couple of operational vignettes to back it up. And my thesis is that the most important work we have in the Department of Defense is digital transformation, to shift from what is an analog system with proprietary data and closed mission systems into one that works at the speed of relevancy against our potential threat. So first story, from 2011 to 2013, I was privileged to work for then General Mattis as his Air and Space Component Commander in Central Command. One of the tasks he gave me was to defend the Arabian Gulf, 6 countries, all bordered and looking north towards Iran with a rather robust ballistic missile and air threat, the closest proximity of which could be a time of flight of 6 minutes. And so I stood on the catwalk looking at my headquarters in Qatar, by the way, the most sophisticated headquarters in the Department of Defense. And I looked down on the floor, and it was arranged somewhat like a football field. I had offense, I had defense, I had a space cell, I had a personnel recovery cell, I had 60 soldiers working 24/7 in a battlefield coordination detachment. I had a Marine cell. So we had all of these individual cells, and I was shocked at how little these cells were able to communicate, how difficult it was to share data, and how cumbersome it was to cobble together an integrated defense to include allies and partners when we had built the systems and allowed industry to do proprietary data that would not be shared with competitors, that did not, and my universal translator on the floor of this most sophisticated headquarters was either a telephone or a yelling across the aisle. And so I came to the conclusion that that making this transition to be able to connect sensors, platforms, weapons, and perhaps most importantly, leaders, using data as a currency of modern warfare is the most important transformation the Department of Defense has to go through. And I would offer with very little political backing. You know, I used to say I was trying to sell highways in a truck town. And I would talk to members and explain to them how important this digital transformation was. And I never once bumped into a highway lobbyist, but boy, I found a bunch of truckers who were focused on what brings constituency, which is platforms and sensors and weapons and proprietary. So we built a framework that then under Secretary Mattis, then as Secretary of Defense, we championed and tried to move forward, which is 4 elements. For it to work as part of a network within the Department of Defense, it has to connect, it has to share, it has to learn, and it must be trusted. It has to connect across open mission systems with allies and partners. It has to connect across platform sensors and weapons. It's got to be able to share data, and that data must be accountable. That data must be accessible, and you have to be able to reach it and use it at the speed of relevance. You've got to bring artificial intelligence to the tactical edge so that you can place more humans on the loop and remove the number of humans that we currently have in the loop working at human speeds. And the final element of this framework was it had to be trusted. The most difficult challenge for a commander in the field is actually not having the screens go blank. Commanders trained to that. The most difficult challenge is having the screens full of data and not trusting it. That's a wicked hard problem to solve. So we built this framework and tried to move it forward. And I'm one that truly believes it's the most important work that the Department of Defense has in front of it going forward. And it will not be easy because culture eats strategy and technology for lunch. And what we're talking about here is a culture change that has got to occur before you will get the technology change and the other things. And the last thing I'll offer you too is I had the privilege of coming out to Stanford for a session right after the Google Maven meltdown. And the discussion we were having is, how do we reconnect? And one of the individuals asked me, I was in uniform at the time, they said, Chief, why are you here? What do you want out of this conference? And I said, well, let me just share with you. I'm actually chief of staff of a startup a garage startup organization. 2 guys, bicycle mechanics, Orville and Wilbur, tinkering in the garage, and the rest, as they say, is history. And my future is in software. But yet today I'm a hardware company. And I cannot get there without Silicon Valley. I cannot get there without what industry brings to the table. And this has got to be a partnership between the Department of Defense and the tech world, to be able to create the environment, create that framework so that the Department of Defense can continue to maintain its operational and strategic edge because it has better information than its adversary. And then I'll finish with just on John Taylor's excellent comment. I came to a belief as 4 years as a Joint Chief that one of the worst things we can do as a nation is use military force without an economic framework surrounding it. Understanding the costs involved, understanding what it's going to require to sustain those operations. And it's one of the reasons that I've now joined with Blackstone as a senior advisor to help the nation economically, to be able to build the wealth that we need to do what our nation needs to do globally. Thanks, Amy.
Well, thanks so much. We've now covered a variety of different issues, from Silicon Valley to the history of startups to how France has managed to become startup nation, and now the DoD transformation. What I'd like to do is take an even further step back and talk a little bit about the geopolitical environment and how I think technology plays a role. And then I want to engage us all in a conversation. We've laid out there are actually some similar themes across what each of you has said. I want to drill down on some of those, starting with speed, so you can think about speed. We hear a lot, and we've heard a lot in the past 2 days about great power competition, which I think is a very misleading term, because it suggests that that we're going back to the way things were before, right? It's the revenge of the state, the return of Thucydides. And that's only about half right? And it's more misleading, I think, than it is illuminating. We've heard for the past couple of days about how great power competition with Russia and China are heating up, and that's undoubtedly true. We need only look at China's recent provocative actions in the neighborhood toward Taiwan. And as I often say, we don't have to guess about China's intentions. They tell us their intentions with documents called Made in China 2025, right? And Xi Jinping's recent 5-year plan, where he declared the intention to increase China's technological independence of the United States and called technology a matter of national security. One of the striking things about that speech and data about it is that China is forecast to spend more money on technology R&D in the next 5 years than on its defense, right? Technology is the linchpin, as General Goldfein has said. But today's great power competition is not like the great power competition of yesteryear. And the biggest difference why is technology. If we think about a range of different technologies, we've got internet connectivity, which we take for granted, but is relatively new. Social media, AI, quantum computing, synthetic biology, the proliferation of commercial satellites, and more. Never before have we stood at the cusp of so many breakthrough technologies converging at the same time. and so many, as my fellow panelists know better than I do, that are inherently dual use with incredible commercial applications and military applications. And so we know this is creating both a positive sum and a zero sum world at the same time, right? AI is poised to provide incredible global benefits. At the same time, it's fueling this zero sum competition with China. And so, and some of my Hoover colleagues have heard me say this before, but I think it's useful to think about the role of emerging technologies in this space as driving what I like to call the 5 mores. The first is more threats on the landscape, more threats that can attack across distance, like through cyberspace. For the first time in human history, good geography doesn't protect us, right? There are no vast oceans that secure us from the bad neighborhoods of cyberspace. Good and bad neighborhoods in the virtual world are all inherently connected and you can't get away from it. For the first time in history, power doesn't protect us either. In cyberspace, our strengths are our greatest vulnerabilities. Our digital connectivity, our free and open democracy. These are the things that are making us vulnerable to cyber attacks, disinformation, interference in our elections, among other things. So the first more is more threats, right? This is not your Cold War landscape. The second more, and John Chambers and John Taylor and David Goldfein have all alluded to this, speed, more speed, right? Faster speed of data, faster speed of decision, faster speed of insight. I think General Goldfein, you called it the speed of relevancy, right? That speed is accelerating. So we have more speed driven by technology, right? So more threats, more speed. Third, more information. And I would add disinformation. Amount of data on Earth doubling every 24 months. Huge implications for democracy. We've started to talk about these in this working group. The founding fathers believed that the answer to bad speech was more speech. And we have built our democracy on that basic assumption. But research now shows that when falsehoods are repeated frequently enough from more and more sources, people believe them. And that's exactly the online world in which we now find ourselves. So in today's technological environment, more speech doesn't lead to truth. It leads to more deception. How do we deal with that? Big challenge for these tech companies. Fourth, more decision makers outside of government that are crucial for national security. Companies are grappling with these huge new responsibilities that they didn't much want, from deciding whether the president gets to post online to whether law enforcement agencies can actually open up an iPhone of a terrorist who has killed people in San Bernardino. So companies, we know, answer to global shareholders, not voters, and their interests don't align exactly with national security. They're overlapping, but they're not perfectly aligned. So how do we deal with that problem? And the fifth, more finally, driven by technology, more intelligence competitors. So thanks to newfangled devices like cell phones and the internet, everyone can collect and analyze intelligence. It's not just for governments anymore. And that's an enormous change if we think about sense making and trying to anticipate changes in the world and have decision advantage. The upshot of the 5 mores driven by technology is this is not your parents' great power competition, right? Technology is changing the fundamentals of geopolitics, and we have to better understand these fundamentals to enhance American leadership and all the things that we want in the world: global security, global prosperity, global freedom. So I'm going to stop my rant there on the 5 mores in geopolitics, and I want to open up the panel conversation. And as promised, I want to start, if I could, by asking each of you to reflect on speed. So John Chambers, you talked about the speed of innovation being 3 to 5 times what it used to be. Can you talk a little more about what that means for not just economic competitiveness, but the challenge of government actually harnessing that innovation? And then I want to turn to John Taylor and David Goldfein to think about how do you think about speed and how do we deal with speed?
I think the easiest way to understand the importance is to do what you do very well, Amy, which is tell a little bit of stories that match. For America to fall out of automotive leadership, it took 4 decades. for the transition that occurred in the technology phase for IBM to fall out of promise in terms of leadership and technology. It took several decades. The speed of change now that used to occur over 10 years occurs in 2. And I have 20 startups that I nurture, invest, and coach, and I love it. But all I need is a 1 to 2 year advantage. And it doesn't matter if it's a big competitor or a small competitor, we've got them. The balance with that is so much of the speed is now going to come from startups. And this is why traditionally we've got our economic power in this country out of big companies getting bigger. They will not only not add headcount, the majority of the big companies will not innovate at the speed that they need to, including defense, which I think Dave articulated very well, because strategy and vision might be the easiest part versus culture and adjusting to change. If you believe that government and business and the citizens must work together in a way they've never done before, you have business that is forced to adjust to the speed or they don't survive. Yet government in so many ways was implemented in a way that prevented us from doing dumb things quickly, and a process that actually built in the checks and balances, which is not at all designed for the speed of decision-making that you have today in terms of the transition. So I like the approach of making a national infrastructure requirement, a national priority of becoming a digital nation that moves with the speed of innovation that is the best example for the world. If we don't, we won't survive. California probably will not lead in the transition again that John commented on earlier about businesses not only leaving, but not coming back to California. So speed is at the heart of everything, and we've got to change our attitude. The talent no longer goes to the big companies or the big government. It used to do that in France or India or here in the US. It goes to startups. One of the hottest startups in the world, a company you never even heard of in New York City, ASAP. They have 58 PhDs of artificial intelligence. They take half that MIT graduating class each year. They can hold their own with the Googles, the Apples of the world, et cetera. So it is that speed combined with talent, with business and government working in a way that we were not designed to do, that I think we've really got to focus on.
I like to think of the advantages of speed. Speed has improved over the years so much. The general can talk about that for big time. But it seems to me that these advantages, again, let me just mention development. Africa, they know what's going on here. They have complete access instantaneously. And that's an incredible improvement of where it used to be, and for the sub-Saharan part of the continent especially. So we need to actually emphasize that more. That's one of the advantages that these firms and others are providing. I'd also say that we want to encourage the good aspects of speed. Amy, you mentioned the problems of a free and open democracy suffering, but I think here, what you want to emphasize is there's competition, should be competition. I think John Chambers was indicating that, new firms getting started, so they don't get squeezed out. And I think there's some concern. There's a lot of discussions of antitrust issues already. I'm not sure they're warranted, but I think that's a question. Let's make sure that firms are not squeezed out by this, because that can happen, in which case we'll lose the good aspects of speed. And I like to emphasize the good aspects. And just finally, we talk about the world itself and being connected. And there's dangers there, of course, but as long as we maintain our, I would say, free markets, open markets, this is a very innovative society. We continue with that, emphasize that's a little bit more of what I mentioned, bringing the economics into security and diplomacy issues. Let's not forget that. It's a real advantage, and we need to emphasize it more.
When I think of speed relative to military operations, and let me offer you one caveat here. I've been working really hard at being a good former and not trying to speak for the current Joint Chiefs or my outstanding successor. So I offer these thoughts really as a retiree and as former chief. For me, when I think of speed, it's the speed of decision making that matters in military operations. How do we provide military combat commanders with the means to be able to act decisively faster than their adversaries can? There's a great visual that I found is pretty helpful, right? Goes back to our history and the midnight ride of Paul Revere, right? One if by land, two if by sea. That was single domain operations. And the problem for the militia was to figure out where to place their defenses and how to command and control those forces. But what if the British could actually have attacked by both land and sea simultaneously? One could argue that that would have been a wicked hard problem to solve. Now I have to split my defenses. Now I have to figure out how to command and control those forces. That is a really hard problem to solve. So we want our adversaries in the lantern buying business. One if by land, two if by sea, three if by air, four if by cyber, five if by space, six by special operations. And we want them to believe that we have the capacity and the capability to overwhelm them from all domains at one time. And if we can achieve that through superior decision making, then maybe we can achieve our overall goal as a Department of Defense, which is to successfully deter. Maybe we can place enough doubt in the mind of an adversary that they question whether they can accomplish their political objectives through military means. You know, if and I'm, by the way, as we get into this, I'm not as hawkish. You might be surprised on China going forward, but I don't want them to believe that they only have to look at their eastern flank. They need to know that they have to be looking up, down, left, right, behind them, in cyber, in space, because not only are we in all domains today, but we can bring all domains to bear. If we can do that, we may be able to avoid ever going into conflict, which is the ultimate reason for generation and maintaining readiness of military might.
So I want to pick up on what you just said, but before I do that, I want to remind our audience members, feel free to join the queue for Q&A by just typing in your question or your comment in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. So General Goldfein, you've given us this wonderful image of the one if by land, two if by sea, and you mentioned 6 different domains. I want to get the panel's reaction to the 7th domain, which is us hurting us, that the adversaries aren't coming from out there, they're coming from in here, which gets back to where we started with John Taylor and the California Exodus. So I want to spend a little bit more time on that and how we're hurting ourselves. So John Taylor, first, can you talk a little bit more about whether the California Exodus is inherently bad? If the Exodus, if the diaspora moves to Austin or Seattle or back to Boston, if it's within the United States, is there a scenario where it's a good scenario or not? And then we'll open it up for comments from John Chambers and Dave Goldfein.
So first of all, I think the notion that firms can go where they're treated the best is fine. In fact, it's not just California. Some of the New York and New Jersey aren't doing that great either. But I think that's okay. The danger, of course, is the other states react rather than California. I'd like to see California react in the ways I indicated, so a more business-friendly environment. Gave some examples where that might be happening, but it's still, the regulatory issues, land use issues are really severe compared to, say, Texas, for example. So I would say that's the advantage is you'll see some reaction on the policy side. And I just hope it's not the Texas and other welcoming places, Florida, reacting the other direction, which is a danger. And I think that's why this is a lesson, which is a more national lesson. We can learn from what's not working so well, maybe California, and we'll learn what's working better, maybe Texas. And we realize that our competitors, China, for example, they're doing this a different way. And so let's not be sucked in the wrong direction, but to use this as an example of how to go in the right direction. So that's what I would say the reason to look at the local issues. First of all, they're very apparent. You can look out your window if you live here. You can go to the parking lots and see the big changes. John knows this much better than I do. So it's right here. We can see what to do about it. We can point to the politicians, and I'd like to do more of that.
John Chambers, you said you lived through Route 128. What can we learn from history, and what more do you want to add to how can we avert the exodus from California to, or at least the loss of technological leadership in the U.S.?
Well, something that I would not have said until really the last 2 decades is government, local and national, have to work together with business for the citizens. And we have to be able to deal with tough, thorny issues in a constructive way. Boston 128, it just happened. And by the time we woke up and realized it was happening, it was too late to change it. California is happening in front of us, and it is still very changeable, but you only have 2 mayors, one Democrat, one Republican, that even grasp what's going on, the mayor of San Jose and the mayor of San Diego, in terms of the direction. And something I would have never advocated for before, we need a national digitization competitiveness plan, inclusive of geography and gender on this. And we also need the ability to educate people what happens when we do not change. However, I think Texas has already won in terms of the next leadership. If I were coming out of Boston now or New York, I would go to Texas. I would look very hard at Florida, but Montana, even West Virginia is redoing their whole curriculum in their universities around startups. And Democrats and Republicans are coming together to think out of box, perhaps because that state lost so much before, that they will change with one state with one vision. So the healthy part of this is maybe it's a wake-up call where all the states begin to think about digitization, but there needs to probably be a national, has to be a national override on it. If we look at where the markets are going, issues like supply chain cannot be done without national priorities and implementation on it. And the research often is the underpinning for future innovation. So that's a little bit how I look at it. I think it will be good for a lot of states. I think it's going to be bad for a lot of states. It should be a win-win across the board.
So let me ask you one more on that, right? So you talk about the national digitization. If you're advising the governor of California, John Taylor laid out a number of different challenges, right? From taxes to land use. We talked a little bit about broadband, but education challenges. If you were advising the governor of California how to reverse the flow out, the exodus of business from California, what would your top recommendations be?
Top recommendation is make business feel welcome. Top recommendation is to go to business and listen, what does it take for you not just to stay here, but for you to grow here? Top recommendation is be open to constructive criticism and say, how do we solve it in terms of an overall approach? I don't know for sure, but I'd be surprised if any government leader called either the CEOs who left or the companies who left or the venture capitalists who left and say, why did you leave? And what do we do to prevent this from happening to others? In a more constructive way, and I think the Secretary of Commerce of the US is actually going to take a crack at this, a national plan for innovation and inclusive job creation that includes major innovation hubs and tech hubs across the nation. How do you integrate this together with a common policy? How do perhaps groups that have not work together uniquely in this would be something that I think is within our grasp and actually very doable right now. And it'd probably be the first thing I'd recommend to this president, that he really empower the commerce lead to think differently about a digital plan, a innovation plan, an inclusive startup plan.
Thanks for that. So General Goldfein, it seems as though what we're hearing, and I know what's coming out of the Pentagon, is that technological innovation is a national security must-have, right? And that it's not just that we're innovating in the United States, we need to figure out how to get that innovation into the Pentagon. So how do you, and I know you spent a lot of time in the Valley trying to bridge the divide between the Pentagon and the entrepreneurial world. So General Goldfein, same question to you. As you think about the innovation challenge in California, what do you think policymakers need to know? What do they need to hear? What would you recommend they think about?
I think we need to tap into what is a known national strength, and that is that we are a very competitive people. I wouldn't put any country on the planet up against America when it comes to competition. We love competition. We live for competition. I remember, I grew up and lived most of my career overseas. And I remember one country I was living in, my good friends and neighbors said, in America, you live to work. Here we work to live, And I thought, there's a little bit of truth to that. We love work and we love to compete, and put us in the ring. And you know what? We're going to jab and fight like the best of them. So my advice would be figure out what obstacles we have to unleashing what is a great strength of American culture, which is our eagerness to compete. And one area I would focus on, and I'm sure this is not this is true at Stanford, it's true at most universities. Chinese students are lining up to enter into our universities. What incentives are out there to have American students lining up to go to Chinese universities? What policy restrictions are there? Certainly COVID's an issue, but beyond COVID, right? As fast as China is moving, what programs are we putting in place to encourage our young, bright, talented individuals to go over, build relationships, understand from the ground floor what's going on in China, and bring that knowledge and information back. Today, it seems to be a one-way street. And I think this is a role for academia, and I think this is a role for the administration to push.
If I can, Amy, just jump in there and follow on Dave's comments. Two things that I think has to change. We have to change our K through 12 system to include innovation, much more competitive on a global basis. We're not competitive at all because we lose many of our young men and women, especially of color or gender, because we make it unexciting and don't get people excited about being in technology and innovation and a part of it. The second is our immigration system is broken. If you look at the hot startups across the US, well over 50% of them are formed by first or second immigrants from around the world. And there's probably no country more important than that in terms of our relationship than India. I believe India and the US have to be the most strategic relationship in the world, economically, defense, culturally, the largest democracy, the first democracy, et cetera. And you need, again, national plans, which I would have never argued about before, but to move with the speed and the economic power needed becomes very key. So that would be my two additional comments to what Dave said.
I want to pick up on another thread of what Dave just said, which is what China is doing. And John, you've also mentioned France has turned things around. India is really a leader in innovation. And so if we focus on China for a minute, because there's a lot of, a lot of casting China as the adversary, but China's doing some things right that we could presumably emulate. So as you all think about, Dave mentioned one, which is sending lots of the best Chinese students to the United States to better understand how we think and how we live, right? And to take some of those ideas back with them. What should we be copying or learning from the China example? And what should we make sure that we don't copy or learn from the China example?
Who do you want to go first?
Well, we can, John, since you asked, you get the first crack at it.
Okay. Well, I know China very well. I was part of Wang Laboratories, and it was really a Chinese company with a great American, Dr. An Wang, leading it. And he invented magnetic core memory walking across the Harvard Yard. I was the only Caucasian ever to run that part of the world for Wang Laboratories. I knew Jiang Zemin very well. We worked together on outsourcing high-tech manufacturing into China at his request. And I learned very early on the effectiveness of their 5-year plans, which I never thought government could plan business 5 years out, and boy, was I wrong. So I think the Chinese grasped much earlier than we did that government and business and economic growth policies over time, we're going to work more effectively together. And it prioritized their resources very, very well. I think our issue is not at all with the Chinese people. I love China. If I were an American, I'd want to be a Chinese. On it, I think our problems with the leadership with a win-lose type of mentality. I personally think they've overreached, and I think that is a major flaw that many countries have to take a look and say, is China really going to be a partner with me long-term, or they really have their own interest purely at heart? I think America needs to get back and learn from Chinese mistake here about how do we become the ally of the world and achieving their country goals, et cetera, as we move forward.
I'll pile on to that and just say, I think that we have to find ways to collaborate where we can and then compete where we must. And understand that international relations between the superpowers are extremely complex. And we can actually find areas where interests align. At the same time, we have a significant number of interests that are in complete contrast. The best example I can give you is, think of our relationship with Russia post-Crimea. Broke diplomatic relations to a large extent. We haven't agreed on much of anything with Russia since the invasion of Crimea. Yet the entire time we've been at each other, we've been living together in the International Space Station. In fact, we've been relying on Russia to get us to and from the International Space Station. And when our astronauts go out for a spacewalk, they rely on their Russian teammates for their life support systems. So one could argue that we have somehow found a way to find common interests above the atmosphere, even though we find none below. Such is the nature of complex international relations, and we have to find those same areas of potential collaboration with China, with India, with all of our international teammates.
So I would add a little bit, maybe go back in history a little bit. China changed quite a bit from Mao to Deng Xiaoping. It was an incredible force for the good. I think they've got off of that recently, unfortunately, in certain dimensions, that's for sure. And I think we don't want to go in that direction. We have benefited from the freedom, economic freedom, whatever you call it. We've had lots of examples of this in this discussion. So what I would say is we do more of that, and we make complaints about Hong Kong, et cetera, continue with that political thing. But I would also say one other technology thing which we're forgetting is this medium we're using now. I have over 3,000 students taking my course this quarter, over 3,000. They're all over the world. Many are in China. In the fall quarter, I took a regular course, and there were Stanford students all over the world, many in China. So let's not forget, this is something that's going on here that is tremendous in terms of communication and explaining things. And I think I was already mentioned the problems in our own country, the K-12, and how many people are not benefiting from this technology. You need to worry about that, but there's a huge benefit here in terms of communication, in terms of getting to know people, having common interests, the kind that I have to say the new call sign David refers to. By the way, General Mattis called call sign chaos. You don't want to be chaos, you want to be David, right? Anyway, thank you so much for that.
So we've talked a lot about the role of policymakers, whether it's the governor of California or a national plan for this or a national plan for that. And I want us now to dial in on the other part of this challenge, which is the role and responsibility of corporations and universities, because there are three legs of this stool. So first, the role of corporations. I love the quote that you have, John Taylor, the woke barons in Silicon Valley, as sort of encapsulating one view of the role of corporations. It seems that there are sort of two areas of bipartisan agreement. One is that China is the enemy no matter what. And the other is that there's something wrong with Silicon Valley. Take your pick of which side you want to be on and how you want to attack it. So as we think about the role and responsibilities of corporations, whether they're startups or huge tech companies like Google and Facebook, how do we start to grapple with what actually should be the role of a company today, especially a company that makes high technology products that have dual use capabilities. I don't know who wants to start with how you think about the role of corporations today. Anyone want to jump in on that?
I'll try it again. I think the issues between big tech and government have been at least half self-inflicted by big tech. If I were to draw a parallel, even though it happened at a slower speed, in the 90s, there was a coordination between Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C. Basically, you found a Sequoia with their managing director, John Doerr, driving that. I was honored to do TechNet with him, and we worked together with Washington and across the states in a very effective way. And while we would have disagreements, we almost never had an issue we couldn't work through. And the internet offered as much opportunity for challenges as anything else, especially after the Snowden event, with information coming out. And yet, even in Russia or China, we were trusted as far as they were going to trust an American company. And there was a direct correlation between what was good for technology was also good for America. And 90% of the Americans really believed that. And you saw the economic growth during the 90s of average household going up 24%. There is a clear message that if tech didn't change, both the Democrats and Republicans told Silicon Valley 5 years ago that if we didn't change, antitrust and regulation was doing, and tech did not come together to work on that. In fact, the individual tech companies wouldn't even meet together. I think that was a huge mistake, which we're going to pay for. And I think you will see regulation and antitrust come. However, we don't want to overcorrect here. Our biggest, as Condi Rice would say, our biggest advantage right now is our top 5 tech companies are the best and strongest and economically most powerful in the world. And we want to make sure that we don't follow the European example on pharmacy or tech or semiconductors that cause them to be non-competitive in the future.
Let me just add, first of all, it's Mike Lee who said the woke barons of Silicon Valley. And I was saying that he's a senator from Utah, a Republican. So I think the sense is this is bipartisan. And there's a lot of concern. Now, he was concerned about this freedom of speech in Parler and Parler getting knocked out by 3 high-tech firms. That made a lot of people angry. So he's trying to fix that. I don't know if it shouldn't require a senator to fix it, but so I think that this competition would help. And Klobuchar wants to give more money or allocate more money to the FTC and the DOJ antitrust division. Maybe that'll help a little bit, but I think that sort of breaking up the firms doesn't make sense to me. As John quoted Condi there, tremendous advantage, but they need to watch it. And I think the best way is they allow competition. They allow these new firms that John Chambers was referring to come out. And I think that'll make a big difference, but we need to find an alternative than both sides just constantly bashing these firms. That's not going to be the answer.
Amy, what I'll offer you is, so I pulled when I was pushing this digital transformation, I pulled in all of the contracting officers across the Air Force. And I said, you own the tipping point. For us to move the needle, we've got to find a way to make what we're asking for profitable for industry. Until it is profitable, we will not see movement, because CEOs of public companies have these pesky folks called shareholders who expect quarterly earnings that they've got to report on. And what's going to bring them quarterly profits is trucks, not highways. So we've got to figure out a way to make highways and networks profitable for industry. I was a little short-sighted when I gave that direction to my contracting team, because industry actually, I think, holds equal responsibility here. If this is in fact where the nation needs to go, if digital transformation is where we all acknowledge we have to move, then we have to find a way to make this profitable for industry. And that, to me, is an area that we have yet to figure out. Once we do, I believe that will be the tipping point that helps us take off as a country to make things more digital. In the meantime, we will continue to move slowly with platforms, sensors, and weapons, and what bring to industry fairly quarterly returns.
It's interesting, Dave, and keying off John's point as well. I've changed my view a fair amount over time on the effectiveness of capitalism. I believe that for companies of the future to be successful, they must represent the return to their shareholders that makes the investment worthwhile, but they owe an equal obligation to society. And if you don't start with that principle, you're going to always have competing goals. And I think if companies, especially the large tech companies, don't balance the benefit to society, the response to society, regulation will get tougher. And even in areas like China, where the balance is very interesting to observe at the present time. And before some of my peers on this call say, well, John, that's really not the job, and it's not going to get the economic return if you do that. At Cisco, we won every corporate social responsibility award there was to win in the world. The Middle East, in China, in India. We won it from Secretary Rice and President George Bush. We won it from Secretary Clinton and President Obama. We were the most profitable company in our industry every year, every major country in the world, and one of the most respected. So I would say that we need to rethink a little bit the definition of capitalism and realize that regulation and many leaders, even on some of them that lean far left, will say, we know we will mess up the regulation, but you've got to either fix it yourself or it will come. And I think we need to think more about the benefit to society at an equal level as we do the economic return, or we're going to have trouble.
Amy, if I could follow up on, because you asked about industry and you also asked about universities.
Yep.
I think universities have an incredibly important role to play on bringing greater understanding of the international environment that we will always operate in when it comes to military operations. And again, I look at military operations as something that we do for the Secretary of State to be able to negotiate from a position of strength to a better place for not only the United States, but more importantly for the world. And so what universities can do, and it strikes me that we've actually moved in the wrong direction over the past several years. You have to work hard to find international news anywhere beyond Washington, D.C. You've got to work extremely hard to garner an understanding of what the international markets are doing at a level that we need to understand in our business schools and in our government leadership schools. And so if we acknowledge that the American way of war and American diplomacy is based on strong and strengthening allies and partners and partnerships, then I think the university system has an important role to play to help us with raising the generation that comes after us to understand the critical nature of international understanding.
I want to make sure that we get to some of the questions that our audience members have raised. So I want to put some of these on the table, and we'll do this popcorn style. Whoever wants to answer can jump in. Although I see John Chambers has a lot of footballs in the background, so my guess is he may go for the pass too. Okay, what can the national government do to help with digital infrastructure, education, and incentives? Right? What can the national government do? And we've touched a little bit on this question before, but I don't know if you all want to weigh in a little bit more on what specifically do you think the government can do with digital infrastructure, education, and incentives?
Actually, let me just pipe in here. I think one of the great values of the education system we've had is there isn't a central control. We have even the state universities and places that we all have gone to. And I think that has created, and after all, Silicon Valley didn't start here without Stanford. It was a factor, and the different way of thinking about things was a factor. So I would not want to squash that out, maintain that. It's a little bit dangerous because we don't know exactly where things are going at this point, but free expression, freedom of thought, I think, is very important. And not just, if I could say one other thing about John Chambers mentioned the role of business. This business roundtable statement about a year ago attracted a lot of attention, and to some extent it was going in that direction, but I think it needs to be interpreted in the right way because it's in the interest of business to
Yes,
do
it
the
is.
thing you mentioned. And just I would add that. That's all.
The other thing that I learned the hard way, having been at IBM and Wang Laboratories and watched Xerox and many other companies, is corporations, especially in high tech, are terrible at pure research. And this is where I believe major government programs have to be in place that encourage research. And the most effective arm for research is the universities. Cisco is an outgrowth of that indirectly through Stanford and others. And so if you watch how much money the Chinese are spending on research and funneling it in their universities, this is a real challenge for us in the future. Or put, Amy, as you said, this is a lesson we can learn from them that we need to reinvent ourselves and really sponsor that. Because most large companies, especially in tech, will not be good at pure research. Yet that's your foundation for the next generation of tech companies in the near future.
So, John, I will just share with you an anecdote that sends that exact point home. There's a computer science professor here at Stanford who says to his PhD students, I want you to present your dissertation topic to investors. And if anyone is interested, I don't want you to do it because it's too applied. And I want you to think of further in the future. It shouldn't be monetizable in the near term. And if it is, then we haven't pushed you hard enough, right? To your point about moonshot research needs to be in universities.
Agreed.
So I want to combine, we have a bunch of questions about China, so I'm going to try to do my best to combine them. So sort of question number one, how does America stack up in AI versus China? AI is a big field, but generally, how do you think the US is stacking up against China in AI? Second part, China question, what about China's move to take control of standards internationally? How serious is this? How important is it? What are your views on that?
Just very quickly, I think AI is one of those 5 out of 20 categories the Defense Department would probably say we're leading in, but our lead in is not as broad. And on AI, China made it a national priority big time, as did France, and we were slower moving. On standards, if you control standards, you influence the future of open communications. And I think it's a real danger the US is not influencing the standards as much as before.
John and Dave, you want to jump in on either the China AI or the China standards question?
Yeah, I would agree with John on sort of where we are. I think there is a dialogue that's ongoing, and there's some important research centers and think tanks that have been thinking about the ethics of artificial intelligence. That's an important conversation to have.
Agreed.
Because while we want to remove as many humans from the loop as we can to move up speed, we never want to remove final decision authority for lethal fires from a military standpoint. We always have to have a human that's in control of that. And we have to have a serious conversation about riskless war and what that means if we move towards robotics autonomy in our capabilities. So for me, I think artificial intelligence is absolutely central to our future. I just hope we have a parallel discussion about ethics and the morality of it as we move forward on the technology.
So I just want to add to that. Authoritarian governments can use artificial intelligence in ways that are not so good. And we have to be aware of that. I think it's going to be an advantage of our free society that we don't always go in that direction. But you started at the beginning, Amy. I forget, it's one of your mores. Better be careful.
So I want to, if we could, come down to sort of the personal leadership side of this. We've talked a lot about wonky policy, but this is a lot about, as you all have mentioned, building trust. And you've all been leaders in that, in the trust area, building bridges. John Taylor's got 3,000 of them right now online, right? Learning economics. So could you share a moment, each of you, when you were trying to cross bridges in these areas where the other side just didn't understand what you were doing? and how you dealt with it. So that's part one. And then number two, when you think about building trust with people that don't trust each other, whether it's local officials, federal officials, or foreign officials or companies, how do we do that? How do we do it better based on your personal experiences?
I think that, at least from my perspective, there's economic principles. I can list them if you like. And it's important to stick to those. If you're whether you're working for Ford or Carter or whatever, the pendulum tends to, in my view, the pendulum swings back and forth politically, but the economics doesn't necessarily change that much. So I just want to say, when you have the opportunities, and maybe there'll be disagreements from Dave and John, but it seems to me that those hard rock principles are good, and we have a tendency to go back and forth, but I would stick to those. And it's hard, that's for sure. If different people, different viewpoints, and that's what I would do.
I think trust is everything, Amy. If you look at a currency's leader, whether you're in business, the currency of leaders, whether you're in business or government or defense, it starts with track record, then is based on relationships, and then it's based on trust. And the broader those can be, the more effective they are. I used the example of the Snowden issues before in terms of trust about the internet or not. Yet the relationships that we'd built with Russia and with China at the executive levels and even with their intelligence groups was pretty solid, and we navigated through that. At a simple level, there's not a customer that I'm aware of in the world that I've ever sold to, and I've sold to hundreds of thousands of them, that I can't go back to. But it goes back to there's trust. Doesn't mean I didn't make mistakes, but track record, building true relationships and trust. And I think that's especially important. Dave, you probably know this better than anyone. Even between military leaders is trust, even though you might have dramatically different opinions on the outcome.
Yeah, and I'll share one story with you. Perhaps one of the greatest attributes that we, especially as Americans, need to bring to the table is humility. It's so easy to walk in as the 800-pound gorilla with the most and the brightest and the biggest, and just sort of muscle through all of our allies and partners who truly want to be part of our team. And so the story I'll share with you is, so 2011, I realized that there was no way I could successfully defend the Arabian Gulf if I didn't bring members of the coalition teammates that were with us from Kuwait to Oman and the 6 countries. If I didn't bring them into the headquarters and start building a cadre of individuals that not only spoke the same language, but actually could build on trust, because there was historical relationships between these countries. So I went to then General Mattis and I said, hey, sir, I'm going to break a little glass here. I want to bring these countries inside my headquarters and build a headquarters within a headquarters. And in typical Jim Mattis fashion, I think he thought about it for 30 seconds and said, cleared hot. I still believe there are foreign disclosure officers that are in therapy over what we did, because we brought Kuwaitis, Omanis, Saudis, and what I told these countries, and it took 10 months talking to ministers of defense and chiefs of defense. And I said, look, what I want you to do is send me a young major and give him to me for 3 months. And when I send him back to you, they're going to speak the language of common defense. And then, like all tide, it rises, all the ships are going to rise. And over time, if we take the art of the long view, we're going to build a population of young officers who not only know each other and trust each other, but speak a common language. And so we did that. And to me, far more important than the technology, far more important than anything we did. What I've heard since then is each one of these classes now have reunions. And, the Kuwaitis host a reunion 1 month, and then the Saudis own and we have now, we can't say trained, but we have developed, almost now hundreds of young officers in these countries that trust each other. And they're going to grow up to be the leaders of their respective air forces. That's the most important investment I think we made in these countries going forward. So, and it's all built on trust. and you gain trust by coming together to solve a common problem. And what was just music to my ears, and I think Secretary Mattis would remember this, I had a Chiefs conference, and we laid out this big map on the floor, and Army calls it rock drill, we called it a big map drill, right? And when you step back and watched a Kuwaiti officer walking through the plans for how Oman would react to a provocation, you don't get that without building trust and confidence across a wide scale. So it's just something we have to invest in.
So we have just a couple minutes left. Talk about building trust and confidence. I need to make sure I maintain my trust and confidence with our audience. There is a question that has been asked that I would love to get a quick answer to before we have to move on. And it's a pretty technical question. I think it's for John Chambers and you, General Goldfein. And here's what he asks. Leading edge semiconductor manufacturing tools are only available from Western companies. And he lists a bunch of Western companies. Chinese companies are precluded from buying extreme ultraviolet lithography machines. How important is that US chokehold here, that US advantage here? Will China be able to remain competitive in AI if they can't design below 10 nanometers? So here's an area where we have an advantage. How important is that advantage for the United States?
Dave, why don't you go first? I'll go second.
Yeah. So not only am I a former, I'm also a philosophy major that took 6 years to get to the Air Force Academy. So you used a couple of words that there that I'm gonna have to go back and look up. Here's what I'll just tell you. Collaborate where we can, compete where we must. What's in our common best interest? Is it a stable and slightly growing Chinese economy, or is it a economy that's getting smaller? I think we'd probably all agree that we want China to grow. Our issues with the Chinese Communist Party, not with the Chinese and not with Chinese business. So there has to be ways that we find common interests that align. And perhaps in the semiconductor business, there may be areas here where we can actually do some partner work. We can actually live in a space station while we disagree on the ground.
I think the situation versus China will probably get tougher before it gets better. Playing field, China should not ask something of us that they wouldn't give American companies in China. I think the challenge, you mentioned the immediate challenge, the much larger supply chain challenges now is that we have to get semiconductor manufacturing capability back in the US. And there needs to be a major policy to make that happen. It is incredibly expensive and capital intensive to do it, which means you've got to have government help us do this. You cannot be dependent upon China or Taiwan for our semiconductor and the elements. And that is true in terms of supply chain potentially becoming corrupted in the process, which you cannot take out during the middle once you find out the problem. So I actually think we need to have a major approach to how we bring semiconductor capability back to the US and technology. I think it's archaic to say we won't let other countries use good technology in a way that benefits their society. So I think there needs to be a balance there, as Dave alluded to as well.
Well, you have toured the world between technology, economics, and governance between the three of you. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with all of us. I want to thank everyone for their questions. And what a wonderful opportunity to hear your thoughts. Thanks everybody for a great session.